Hello, welcome to How to Garden. Today's discussion is going to be on how to deal with the summer heat in your garden. There's a couple of different things that I'm going to go over during this. I'm going to wait until a few more people get here. Alright, so I guess I'm going to go ahead and start. There are several things you need to consider when you're dealing with the summer heat. Not just with yourself, but with your plants. When it gets above 90, there are certain plants that just simply are not going to produce, such as tomatoes, and they're going to need some protection. Now, one good technique for being able to deal with these problems is called shade cloth. You can order it online or usually get it at most home improvement stores. Sometimes it's pretty expensive. It does help a great deal if you're able to put up poles and then put up shade cloth over your area. I know plenty of folks that like to do that a great deal. However, there are a lot of people out there that just can't afford to drop a few $100s on some shade cloth. So we're going to discuss some of the other techniques that are easy to do outside of just shade cloth. One of the big problems a lot of people have is finding that they need to water midday. Not really the best thing for your plants, but you got to do it to save them. So there are various different types of systems in which you can use for watering, anywhere from a drip system to a drip tape. Others are still using old school sprinklers, and that's fine in most cases, but some plants don't like to get wet, and they'll end up having mold issues such as cucumbers or many different squashes. A good thing that you can do quickly if you need to save just a handful of plants is to take a gallon jug and poke a hole in the bottom of it. Then go ahead and just sit it next to the plant. Fill it full of water, put the lid on it so it slows the drip. You go back out and fill it once or twice a day as needed, and it'll help a great deal with them having to be rewatered and dealing with the heat. Another option is called an Olea. Now, what an Olea is basically an unglazed pot that's sunk into the ground that you can fill water in, and it seeps out of the pot and takes care of things for you. It's very, very old school, but it's very, very simple to do. The downside of the Olea is it takes up a lot of real estate. The bigger the Olea, the more area it takes, but the smaller the Olea, the more you have to refill it. So that's something that you need to consider. I tend to use Oleas mostly in large pots where I can sink it in the center, but I have put them in the ground before. Another thing that you can do as a substitute to the shade cloth is screening. You can get your standard rolls of screening, can be used or whatever, and put that up, and it does help. It's not as good as a shade cloth, but you can double it over or even triple it over and have it work just as well. I know quite a few people that use that technique with their orchids. They build these very elaborate boxes, and they keep orchids directly out in the sun, but with that type of screening cloth over it. orchids here in Florida burn up, and you need to reduce the light exposure down by 50%. You can use the same technique on a vegetable garden. Another technique I've seen, though I wouldn't think most people would want to use it, is where they put a fan at the end or either end of a garden. I've seen this technique used a lot out in vineyard. Industrial fans at the end of each row of the grapevines, and they push air through it. It helps. The airflow helps a great deal, but you're still dealing with temperatures in the 90s. And it works very well on an industrial scale, but I don't really know anybody that's ever did it in a home garden. I do know people that'll take the fan out with them and set it up so that they have a fan while they're working, or even an umbrella. That kind of helps with them personally. I do know one lady in particular that has a nice little chair and a fan and a very large beach umbrella that she carries around her garden this time of year. She's getting on up there in years, can't really work through the heat, but she'll take that out during the day, earlier in the day, and set it up and be able to work through her garden for 4 or 5 hours early in the morning, and if weather permitted, for 2 or 3 hours later in the afternoon. Other things you might want to consider when you're dealing with this type of heat is what it is you're growing. See, if you happen to be growing a tomato that was originally being grown or developed in Russia and you're in Florida, it's already dead this time of year. So selecting out plants that can deal with the heat is a great deal. And you can do this by seed saving. You watch the plants and see which ones actually performed well for you, which ones perform through the heat, and you take the seeds from those. And after 2 or 3 to 5 generations, you might have something that is completely adapted to your environment. I know quite a few people that have done this with a variety of different things. Recently speaking with somebody who did this with watermelons here in Florida and developed his own breed of watermelon that will grow right through anything. It's seen 120 degrees with 100% humidity, and it didn't blink. So seed selecting so that you can get what is best for your environment is a good way to go. Hello, Pete's Little Homestead. Nice to see you. Other things that you can do is when you're actually buying your fruits and vegetables is to check to find out whether or not they have a heat-tolerant variety. Right now, there are quite a few heat-tolerant varieties of tomatoes being sold for Florida that are supposed to grow right through our season. That hasn't really been the case when I've tried them, but they did last longer. They made it into June last year before they completely died, which was a vast improvement. For people that are growing a lot of their fruits and veggies in pots, if you happen to have a large tree in your yard or an area that is shaded, you might want to move those over into the shade this time of year, just so that they get a couple hours of direct sun. You don't want to put them in the full dark. You just put them on the edge of the shade where it's still quite bright, but they're not getting that direct exposure. I do this with my tomatoes during the late spring and early summer. I start them out in full sun, and then I move them into a shaded area where they get to finish off before they die off from the heat. I've tried this with squash as well. It seems to work very well. Florida tends to have slightly different problems with the squash and the humidity tends to take it out before the heat does. Other things you're going to want to do is make sure that you are going out and checking on them. And sometimes that really sucks because you're going outside, it's 90-something degrees, feels like 100-something degrees, but just going out for 10 minutes And taking a look can make all the difference as to whether or not you save a plant. I do know a gentleman that he does all his major gardening at night, but won't go out during the day. And he keeps saying, "Well, I go out in the early evening, go check on my plants, and they're all dead. I don't know what's happening." And I was like, "Well, have you gone out during the day and taken a look?" And he was like, "No, I haven't done that." Well, in his particular case, it turned out that the high-rise building behind him that happened to have mirrored glass, that between 1 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon actually reflected the sunlight directly into his yard and fried everything. He would have never have known that had he not gone outside and saw how the sun moved and how the light was reflecting off that building. He ended up being able to fix that problem by taking some lattice and putting it on some poles and shading that area where when the light came off of that building, it hit that lattice instead of his plants. It ended up saving him probably $6,000 or $7,000 in gardening every year because he has a very extensive garden. Like I mentioned, he actually likes to go outside and do a lot of his gardening at night. That is also another option. You can go outside if you can set yourself up some lights, and you can go out and work in your gardens after the sun goes down for an hour or two. I've been known to do this, particularly in August, where I'll go out around 10 o'clock at night, light up the backyard, and go out and do what I can in that light. You still get a lot done. And, it's 82, 84 degrees, and that's a whole lot better than 101. Hey, Pete, you got any questions? And what zone are you in? And some of the best ways I've found to be able to deal with the heat down here in Florida is to have poles that are basically set up around your garden area that you can pull some form of shade cloth over. These poles come in handy during winter because then you can pull a heavy plastic over it and protect the plants during the coldest time of year. So having those installed makes it a good dual purpose. Ah, Pete, you're in Kentucky, 6 feet. Awesome. 90 up there? Wow. Y'all aren't used to that much heat up there, I'm sure. It's been a very, very hot year. We've been pretty steady at 96 to 98, feeling like about 106 down here. You don't go outside very long. 90+% humidity, it kind of sucks. You go outside for 10 minutes, check on everything, get a game plan, go back out with the hose and hit it if you need to. Generally speaking, though, most of it I've done move to the side into the shade, or planting heat tolerant plants like okra and peppers, things like that. Things that can actually take the heat. Okra being a tropical plant, it can take the heat with no problem whatsoever. I got quite a few eggplants and a lot of peppers going, but that's about it this time of year. I do got some black-eyed peas going. A few other things you're going to want to consider with dealing with the heat here is basically whether or not you want to have to deal with it. Some people don't have the physical ability to be out in that heat. When that happens to be the case, you need to find some alternatives. Sometimes that means hiring somebody, which is usually not the best option. But you could consider mentoring someone who wants to learn how to garden that's in your local environment might be willing to come over and help you out in that garden and help keep you out of the heat so that they can learn something. It's a good way that you can do a partnership with somebody. It's actually how I learned quite a bit of gardening when I was younger. I had a great uncle that liked to garden, and he couldn't really take the heat. He'd work in the morning, and I'd come over, and he'd work outside for a couple hours, and he'd give me a list of things that I needed to do. And I'd do them. He'd go inside and get out of the heat. He couldn't really take it. You can do this with your kids. You can do this with somebody that you maybe met at church or a local club. A lot of times you'll find local clubs are full of people that join the club to learn how to do something because they simply don't know how to do it. And if you're willing to give them information and show them how to do it, a lot of times they're very interested in coming in and taking a look, seeing how you're doing it, and trade it out for some labor, especially if they get fresh produce for it. It's a win-win situation. Right now, with our current situation, a lot of people are out there trying to learn how to grow things themselves. And unfortunately, most people think it's as simple as just throwing some seed in the ground and you get produce. Yeah, Pete, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Some people can't deal with the heat. Good way to deal with it is to mentor somebody or teach a family or a friend what you're doing. They can that can take the heat. You send them out in the heat. You trade knowledge for labor. You're surprised how many people are willing to do that these days, especially with our current situations. Hi, Life Adventures in Keto. Nice to see you. Other things that I've found to deal with the heat personally is getting these towel wraps that you can wrap around your neck. You wet them down, good cold water, wrap it around so that it's touching your carotid arteries, and this will help lower your body temperature. It can make the difference between passing out trying to get work done. I mean, a big difference. Sometimes you have no choice but to get something done. Others is making sure that you take a good break and go inside and cool off. It's not like back in the day where we didn't have air conditioning and you just kind of work through it. You can, generally speak, go in, spend a half an hour inside, get a good cold drink, cool off. Another thing I've also found specifically down here is to lose your hat. Generally speaking, most people down here wear a hat when they're out in the sun just so they can protect either their face or their neck, depending on how they have their hat turned. But that also holds heat on top of your head, and that can overheat you. Sometimes it's just as simple as taking your hat off, or even wetting your hat down. I've done that out in the field quite often. Just go over, wet my hat down, put it back on my head, drop my body temperature, and I keep working. Y'all have any questions that I might be able to answer? It depends on exactly what I'm growing. Life's Adventures, I do rotate, but not everything. There are some things that I will grow continuously year after year in a particular bed. And those will usually happen to be beans. However, things like corn, squash, um, anything that is a tomato or potato or a relative, I rotate those around. Um, Mostly just to deal with pests, make sure it doesn't, become something where they just kind of know that's where you go. However, I deal with most of those problems by interplanting various different things together. So it's not as much of a problem with having to rotate. For instance, I'm very fond of planting in guilds where I'll have a tree that shades an area, I'll have a bush underneath it, I'll have a vine growing up that tree, I'll plant some beans in there, some squash, or another form of ground cover to keep it cooled off, and I'll mulch the whole thing during the year so that it provides nutrients for it. And I just kind of go around the garden and set up most things like that. Sometimes I just kind of walk around and go, hey, I want to plant here and stick a seed and see what happens. That's how I've been able to identify certain zones where certain plants will grow easier than in others. Strangely enough, I do better with my kale in the shade than in the sun. It can be better life's adventures to rotate. It really depends on whether or not you're growing in designated gardening spots, and it can. The reason it can be better is that the plants can strip nutrients from that area, which if you're adding enough stuff to your soil, that's not as much of an issue. But you can also get funguses and viruses that are specific to that type of plant growing in that area. A good example of this that I know is a gentleman up in Kentucky, maybe Tennessee, that was growing garlic year after year after year in the same spot. And he got some type of fungus that was in the soil that just started killing it year after year. He had to quit growing in that spot and move it to somewhere else. Unfortunately, because it was so bad, he actually lost the variety of garlic that he had spent over 20 years developing. Fortunately for him, shortly after, somebody that he'd given some of that garlic to brought him a few bulbs and said, here. Had he been rotating or planting in guild systems or companion planting, he probably wouldn't have had that problem, but he had a 10-foot by 70-foot bed that he planted nothing but garlic in year after year. And eventually, a fungus came along and adapted, and it was in the soil. He wasn't able to grow in that spot for any type of garlic or onions for 10 years. So, being able to rotate can make a difference. Pete, it is better to rotate beans and potatoes. Yes, couple different reasons. The beans are nitrogen fixers, so if you grow beans in one spot and then follow it up with another crop, you've added nitrogen directly to the soil. Therefore, it has a chance to. It reduces what you need to be able to feed it. Also, because you're rotating it, it changes to completely different species. It deters various different bugs and things like that because they just don't know it's there. A good way to confuse them is to plant various things along the edges as well. I'm particularly fond of growing beans in an area the year before I planned on planting something major. Like one year I wanted to do a bed that I planned on putting a couple fruit trees in, but I wanted the soil to start to get better. So I went ahead and I laid down a lot of mulch and a lot of compost and grew peanuts and beans there the first year. I didn't even harvest them. That wasn't even the point. I literally chopped it, dropped it, and then I planted my fruit trees there. A lot of peanuts still come up. It's been like 4 years, 5 years now, and I still get peanuts that pop up there. But every succession of those peanuts is feeding nitrogen in those trees, so I don't have to use much fertilizer. I just go over there and mulch those beds once, maybe twice a year, depends on how quickly the mulch breaks down. Uh, Life's Adventures with Kale. Kale is extremely easy to grow. It's a pioneer species of plant. Basically, if the soil has been disturbed, there's no grass, there's no weeds, there's nothing like that, and you get yourself some good kale seeds, I'd recommend you try to trade for some from a local gardener so you get something that's more acclimated to your area. You can literally just throw them on the ground and kind of brush them in, and they'll come up. Depending on where you're at, you want to be able to find out when the best time it is to plant those. Down here in Florida, it's actually best for me to plant them in late February, and if I'm lucky, they'll go until this time of year. I got a really nice blue Russian kale out there right now that a couple local bunnies have decided that they really like, much to my second daughter's dismay, because that kale was for her. Life's Adventures. With your raised bed, are you tilling it every year or are you doing a no-till system? Never really know how long the delay is on these things. Alright, so you're tilling every year. Uh, I've actually gotten away from tilling every year. I'll till the first year, but after that, I just add everything directly on top. And I used to till every year. And the reason I stopped was it was starting to really, really hurt my back to be out there tilling every year. For a couple of years, I did some direct comparison with me tilling every year. And my soil, which Florida soil is basically beach sand, was about the same as it was every year. I'd add, 100 pounds of compost, some black cow, horse manure, biochar, whatever it was that I happened to have around, and I'd till it in year after year. My soil wasn't really improving. It'd be fine for that season, but the rains would wash it out here. You get through the summer and it's just gone. It didn't matter how much you put in there, it was just gone. So I did a side by side comparison, literally side by side. And I did one where I tilled it the first year and I added all the stuff. I did one that I already tilled every year and I tilled everything in. And the third one, I literally just dumped everything on top of the ground and grew in the compost that was right on top and let it go in. Never tilled that spot again. Still haven't to this day. It's been 5 years, and that's actually one of the best spots in the garden. And all I did was quit tilling it and start dumping everything on top. I was trying to figure out exactly why that was, and somebody had mentioned to me that it has to do with the carbon cycle. That every year when you till, you re-expose what was in the soil, the carbon, to the air, and it would create carbon dioxide and release your carbon back into the air. Where if I just threw it down every year on top and then covered it with a mulch, it would compost down into the soil, and earthworms, bugs, and other critters would carry it down into the soil for me. Oh, I've been running those three beds exactly the same every year, and the no-till the first year really sucked. Second year it was okay. Third year it was good. I'm on my fifth year there, and it is by far outperforming the ones that I've tilled every year. in life's adventures, I do a lot of the wood chips. I've actually picked up a couple different tricks with picking them up. Here locally, I can get a lot of wood chips by there's these orange trucks around here by a company called Asplin. I happen to know that on Monday mornings they tend to meet up at a local gas station, all the management for this area, and they discuss what areas they're going to go to trim the brush and tree limbs away from the power lines. I'll go up there and I'll just hand them a note and be like, hey, I can take a couple of those wood chips. They'll bring it right to my house and dump it for free, anywhere between 3 and 10 yards for free. Dump it right at my house. Stuff's great. I lay that stuff on pretty thick, 10 inches to a foot. If it's a new bed and I'm not planning on growing in it for a year, I'll dump it 2 feet thick and let it compost down. The no-till works very well, but it takes time. But the gains grow year after year. There's also the root stout method, which is essentially throwing down hay. It's a good method. It basically comes down to the same thing as the wood chips. You're throwing down a biomass directly on top of the soil and letting it compost down. There are some cautions you need to take into effect when using the straw and hay right now. There is a broadleaf herbicide that is being used in hay fields and with corn, things like that. Anything that's a grain or grass. If you get that contamination, it's a long-term contamination. You get that into your soil, that area is pretty much toast except for growing corn and grains for 5 years. So if that's a spot that you'd like to grow squash or tomatoes or beans, yeah, it doesn't work out so well. I actually got hit by it about 6 years ago from a farm that's not that far from me. I'd been going there and getting horse manure from them for 10 years. I got several trash cans worth of half composted horse manure. I brought it home and I threw it in my garden beds, and now I only grow grass there because it killed everything. So I actually moved my vegetable garden from one side of the yard to the other because of it. The only thing to this day that will grow there is grass. I've planted all kinds of stuff over there. Every year I go over there and I plant something to see if it's any good. And it's getting better, but it's not good yet. Hi, the Tinkerer's wife. Hi, short bus pull up. Nice to see y'all. If you have an extra spot and you want to run a side-by-side comparison, I do recommend doing no-till. Over time, it does make a big difference. Another thing that I've had pretty good success with is called Hugel mounds. Slightly modified version. It's basically a raised garden bed with a wood frame, but beforehand I dug it out several feet underneath where I planned on putting the wood framing, and I had an old oak tree that had been cut down on my property that was starting to rot pretty good. And basically I threw a half an oak tree in that hole and covered it back up and then started growing on it. And just year after year throwing various different types of compost, whatever happened to be on hand, wood chips, my own compost. A couple times I've had a couple truckloads of compost actually brought to me. Whatever happened to be on hand on that, and that's one of my most productive beds. The only major issue I've had with it during all this time was it was slow to get started. It took a couple of years because all of the carbon I threw in the ground there needed nitrogen. And since I don't use synthetic nitrogens it took a little while. I grew a lot of beans in it a couple of years in a row. That helped a great deal. I got some horse manure, and that helped a great deal. I'm glad you taught me too, Tinker's wife. I normally don't do this time of day. It just happened to be an opportunity where there was nobody else here to be noisy. They kind of went off to their own room, so I'm taking advantage of it. I normally can't do this until 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I will have to get off of here soon, probably another 15, 20 minutes, but at least I'm getting one in the middle of the day. Well, for me, the middle of the day. I found that over time, the no-till works really, really well. And once you get about 10 or 15% carbon into the soil, you start getting rid of other problems such as drainage and water retention. Uh, I've never been able to get to that type of percentage here in Florida by tilling. Didn't matter how much I tilled in. I could till in a truckload of compost. Come the next year, it'd be gone. Just rinsed out by the subtropical rains. Sands is adding small amounts of clay. Getting your hands on clay here in Florida is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. We do have native clays here, but you generally don't have access to them. But I did find a really interesting trick to solve this problem. Unscented white cat litter is mostly clay. Doesn't really take a whole lot to be able to pick up a bag of it. I don't use it with cats and then put it out, but I can get a couple bags of kitty litter and just kind of toss it around in with my mulches, and adding that small amount of clay has extended how long all the mulch and the compost hangs around in that area. Where me just dumping large amounts of the compost right on top of the no-till did increase my carbon content in my soil a great deal. By adding that small amount of clay, it extends how long it stays dramatically. We're talking just a few handfuls in a standard 4x8 garden bed, just spread out a couple times a year. Makes all the difference in the world. I believe the way it was explained to me originally is that it encapsulates some of the compost, protecting it from the rains and direct exposure to the sun and the air, allowing it to hang around much longer. Oh, Tinker's like, you're lucky you have a clay-based soil, but it drains well. Most people that have a clay-based soil, it doesn't drain well for them. They need to add sand to it. I know in northern Alabama, where I happen to had gardened one season, it's a clay-based soil, and it holds the water really well right on top. It just pulls up, and you won't even realize how deep the mud goes. You'll be like, oh, look, there's a little mud puddle over there, and you step out of your car because you pulled up there, and all of a sudden you're up to your waist in red clay. I can't really say I enjoyed that experience. Um, Life adventures in keto. Chicken manure, especially composted down, or the compost from the run of your chicken coop, It's one of the best things that you can be adding to your soil. I'm actually going to be building a chicken coop later this fall. I've got all the wood and everything already put together, and I'm assembling the parts so that I can make a run. I actually planned on getting it done this spring, but some things came along where I really wasn't able to go out and do what I needed to do, and then it got too hot. It was just entirely too hot outside for me to be out there building a chicken coop. So it's going to have to wait this fall, which is okay because the original goal was to have it all ready by next spring so I can get chickens. It is almost time for me to have to go so that I can get a few different things done today. It has been very nice seeing y'all, and I hope to see y'all again soon. If anybody has any questions right now, I'll be happy to answer anything. Bye, Patty. Bye, Life's Adventures Keto. Bye, Pete. And there's at least a few other people that are just kind of haunting but not saying anything. So, bye, y'all, too. And you have a good day.